There was only the sound of running water. The currents proclaimed themselves like shouting rapids reflecting off the walls so close to Claire's ears. Yet, what she felt pressing against her shins was a gentle trickle. Having tossed her boots away during the confrontation with Civvy, she ran the soles of her feet along the cold, smooth surface of stone underneath her. The flow had carved a narrow trench toward the mouth of the cave so long ago. It was awkward at first, her big toe and pinky toe being forced upward and bunched into the others, while the middle part of her foot sunk down. But when her arms extended further to either side to keep her fingertips connected to the cavern walls, the surface below widened as well. No longer a trench, the uneven textures told her feet of smooth mounds of rocks, sudden ditches, and groupings of pebbles. At times, her toes slipped up a large stone, bringing one foot out of the water. Her other foot was still submerged, slowly sifting underneath those loose minerals. All the while, she was aware of the times her breath bounced off Imala's back. That was the only way she knew her ex-comrade was still there, and how close. She would pause, letting Imala move forward before taking another step. On occasion, Imala slipped to either side, just enough to expose Tayek's glowing arm. Despite the loud echoes, navigating with touch, and the lack of conversation, they were still in proximity to one another. Claire was almost surprised. Tayek seemed to express some devotion to a set of rules, but for how long? Her skepticism was one of the many reasons why she chose to be at the back of their group. She was trying to figure out what that smell could have been when her eyes targeted some light ahead. It was then she remembered the mist breathing against her cheeks, because this faint yellow glow exposed swirls of moisture in the air. It hit her then that she was catching the pungent aroma of fungi. No doubt the slimy coating underneath her fingertips was just that. She didn't take her hands away, though, opting to keep what anchors she had of her surroundings until more came into focus. Each time she caught a glimpse of Tayek's glowing arm, it was resting at his side. She didn't know if he was feeling his way through with his other hand, just as she had been, but even while approaching this source of light, there was no response from him, no change in his posture. Remembering that he was at least 2 feet taller than she and Imala, that made her question her own assumptions of how low the ceiling of this corridor was. Then again, she couldn't tell if he had been hunching the whole time or not. She could only see so much of the light because the corridor was curving a bit to the left. This was made apparent when Tayek stepped into the glow. She could see the majority of his left side as he was stepping in that direction. Her eyes jumped to the right when a section of the corridor moved and started to separate from the rest. She then recognized Imala's braids, the shape of her arm angling out toward the uneven surface to the left, but stopped short of making contact. Her features were washed by the light as she went into the slight turn. Claire squinted when she entered the glow. Looking down out of reflex, she saw the ankle-deep water. How clear it was. Every bit of those textures she had been feeling with her soles winked at her with a polished glimmer. When she looked up, before she even laid eyes on the source of this light, the first thing she noticed was the lack of heat from it. Not expecting a sconce in all this surrounding moisture, she grinned when all there was to see was a yellow ball of light. It wasn't so bright that she immediately had to look away. Much like the one she had carried with her into the cave and then dispersed soon after, this conjured ball of light was attached to the left side of the corridor, unaffected by the grimy surface. Whoever placed it had considered the shock to the senses it would have been at full strength. Or maybe the need to conceal as much as they could without handicapping themselves was the idea. Whatever the case, Claire was glad to be able to see her surroundings. Tayek and Imala were leaving the edge of this light, only to enter another one. A similar source was attached to the right side of the corridor ahead of them. Beyond was another on the left. As the walls spread further apart, Their bottom portions sloped inward before diving underwater, creating ledges that widened as this tunnel stretched onward. Since there was more space now, Claire moved out from behind Taek and Imala, wanting to see as far ahead as she could. The conjured lights continued to map out this corridor, but none of them burned beyond the allotted restraint offered. Nevertheless, their combined efforts exposed the wall of stone waiting ahead. She started to question Taek, giving the intensity of the echoes no longer pressed against their ears. She thought her voice would be heard. Yet, she hesitated when Imala leaned to the side to look around the man, apparently noticing as well what waited not too far ahead. The strength of the currents hadn't changed, but Claire wanted to pause in place and listen. Taek and Imala kept going, but the absence of her own contributions to the sloshing of water was heard. Imala paused, subtracting her own contributions as well, but she wouldn't dare take her eyes off Taek, who seemingly paid them no mind. Claire looked upward, expecting to find a hole of some sort in the concaved ceiling. Perhaps there was a small stream of water pouring down and splashing off one of the ledges beside them, but she saw nothing of the sort. Leveling her gaze, she and Imala watched Taek reach the wall of stone and then turn to the right. The last conjured light was on the left, near that supposed dead end. Its radiance exposed much of the rocky surface on the opposite side, but from the angle in which she and Imala were looking, there was no shadow cast to show the breach Taek was about to step through. Like an optical illusion, the surface appeared to continue on and connect with that dead-end wall. Imala hurried after him just before he disappeared through that opening. Claire rushed to catch up to both of them. The running water had pooled there in front of that wall, but now that she was next to it, she could see the wall didn't meet the cavern floor. The stream was flowing from a wide hole at the bottom, yet it not only sent the current down the corridor from which they came, but also sent it through this vertical narrow opening where Taek and Imala just entered. There were more sources of radiance established ahead, because she could see a space larger than this corridor expanding beyond the breach. When she watched both Taek and Imala's heads dropping down out of sight, it suddenly made sense where the loud splashes were coming from. She stepped through the breach and stood at the top of a stair-like incline. Making sure her footing was secure, she ignored the currents rushing alongside her ankles for the moment and took in the rest of this new area. The rocky ceiling stretched away for several feet until meeting a layer of bricks. The wall at her immediate left did the same thing. This chamber opened to the right, exchanging rock for gray bricks. The two walls farthest from her were made up entirely of this ancient surface. Imala had paused on her way down the incline to study this setup as well. She was only a step away from arriving at a solid flat platform. Straight ahead, it ended with a sheer edge, while actual stairs continued to trip down to the floor to her right. Most of the water hugged her feet and went over the edge, but the excess veered to the side and cascaded down those steps. No matter what path, all the water fed the pool at the bottom. The entire floor was flooded, and because the water was still just as clear, it looked to be only as deep as to swallow their ankles. Claire watched her footing as she made her way down to the platform to join Imala. They both exchanged a glance. Imala was grinning. "How long has this place been here, you wonder?" she asked. She had to raise her voice above a whisper to be heard. With the waterfall near them, the incessant trickle and splashing down the incline now behind them, breaking upon each step until reaching the floor, it was a wonder all this noise didn't escape the crevice at the end of the stream that brought them here. Even the ceiling was dripping. At first, Claire thought that might have been due to cracks in the layer of bricks, noticing how they didn't exactly form a smooth surface throughout. Then she was reminded of the accumulation of moisture. It looked as though the very walls were sweating. She spotted several pairs of iron brackets placed about the sides of this room. Either they were just rusted relics, or were all that was left of places to set torches. No longer in use, the chamber was instead lit by the same conjured lights found in the previous corridor. Set up in trios, Claire and Imala were given enough radiance to where they no longer questioned each step they took. Taek was already at the bottom of the stairs. When he reached the flooded floor, his feet splashed through the currents as he turned toward the center of the chamber. Then he turned again to his left and kept walking. Claire and Imala moved over to the edge of the platform and looked down to see him passing by below. He distanced himself from the waterfall at their feet, and they were able to see where the loudest noise was coming from. Looking to the left, they saw an arched doorway in the wall, bordered by larger stones jutting out from the surrounding bricks. The space beyond was lit because they could see a section of the floor just past the threshold. Taek hadn't even looked up to notice that they were hanging back. Before he reached that doorway, however, they hurried down the set of stairs and splashed through the pool to catch up to him. The next room had a lower ceiling. A series of brick walls ran ahead along the right, just within arm's length. It was a series because portions were missing. The once rectangular openings were crumbling at their sides. Whoever was placing the conjured lights didn't bother exposing the spaces beyond those openings, though Claire noticed a single rusted hinge still bolted to the brick in the top corner of one. Since a lot of the bricks had fallen away, she figured that the other hinges, along with the scraps of boards that used to form a door, would be found in the rubble. Curious if they were rooms or more doorways to other passages, she wondered if the rest of this room would give her clues. The section along the left was established by a raised platform. It was just high enough that it wasn't underwater, and one could step up onto it with ease. It acted as a channel to push the currents on down to the other end of the room. All the conjured lights were sticking to that wall, which was sort of strange to Claire. None of the furniture on the platform was apparently of use. Out of the several piles of broken boards, one happened to resemble a table. Tarnished dishes, abandoned at some unknown point in time, still sat along its slanted surface. There was one bowl that happened to be right under a spot of the ceiling that dripped. Because of the tilted tabletop, the bowl gathered only so much water until it poured over the edge and ran down the soggy wooden surface to eventually dribble onto the stone platform. Taek ignored it all and kept walking. Ahead was another arched doorway. They assumed the space beyond was a hall, given that all they could see was another wall facing them. When Taek entered, he turned to the right and disappeared. Claire and Imala hurried through the doorway and turned to see the hall only headed in that one direction. It was a corridor almost as cramped as the cave that brought them here. The conjured lights were sticking to the low ceiling this time. The flow of water was pushing against the left side just across from the doorway, forming a tiny gurgling rapid. Again, they experienced that exaggeration of sound because of the limited amount of room. It made them think the water was flowing faster than it really was. "Seriously," Imala said, "how long has this place been here?" Her voice carried in that narrow space because Taek slowed his pace and looked over his shoulder to respond. "The people who live along the river have ancestors that used to occupy this temple." "A temple, you say?" Imala snickered, having caught up to him. Claire was close behind her. Taek waited for all the splashing from their footsteps to settle before he continued. "Forgotten by this country, but our community keeps its memory alive." Glancing about the close-knit walls, Imala snorted, "I bet." There were holes where some of the bricks had fallen onto the floor. Either they had been kicked out of the way, or where they landed was their final resting place. Half of their forms were above the water, while those who broke into pieces were nothing more than small chunks for the currents to fall over. Claire's mind was elsewhere. Taek spoke of community, but she remembered how Civi was sneaking by that one structure where those men were having their hushed meeting. Who was he actually referring to in regards to this so-called community? Another arched doorway led them to a large chamber. Taek kept walking, but Claire and Imala paused to take in the setting. The water exited the corridor at their backs, washed over a short stretch of level floor, and then dropped down into another pool. The foundation here was established by several tiers. The middle of the room was now a basin, although they assumed that wasn't its original purpose. The contour of the basin, carved out of the main floor they stood upon, was fashioned into a shape resembling an hourglass. One end lay near them, while the other was placed at the far side of the room. Another raised platform sat against the wall to the right. It didn't extend the entire length. The edges were cut to act as steps, bringing someone up to a long stone rectangular table, which spanned almost the full length of the platform. Between the table and the wall were several chairs made of stone, their surfaces mildewed and discolored. Some of the conjured lights sat upon the tops of their backrests, others adhered to the walls, but Claire and Imala found themselves wondering what lay hidden in the upper section of this room. Centered along the left wall was the base of a set of stairs. It was triangular in shape, one side attached to the wall, while the one point was nestled within the central curve of the basin and aiming at the table on the other side. There were cubbyholes dug into the sides of the base, facing outward. What had Claire and Imala's attention was the stairs leading down from the top of the base. They stopped halfway, with the remainder being a large pile of rubble gathered below. There were too many shadows hiding what could be seen above, but they could plainly see the thick piece of stone stretching over the middle of the room, connecting that base to a point above the table. The right wall didn't reach all the way to the assumed ceiling like the wall to the left did. The conjured lights exposed its full height, which was level with the top of that stone walkway. A clear line of darkness took up the rest of the space, giving Claire and Imala the impression that there was another room or balcony of some sort up there. Teik paid all of it no mind, walking around the basin and in front of that platform with the table. Claire and Imala hurried after him. The back wall was only given 2 conjured lights, and they were spread far apart from one another. Yet, the large hole in the middle couldn't be ignored. It wasn't a doorway fashioned by a carpenter. More like someone had set some type of explosive on the other side. The result was a pile of bricks and stone having spewed forth onto the floor and down into the basin. The space just beyond the hole was complete darkness. "Where's Civvy?" a voice asked. Claire and Imala froze in place. Despite the echoes carried about that room, their eyes were locked upon the hole. Teik kept walking, but he answered the voice. "Her place has been taken." There was a pause, and the voice asked, "By which one?" Teik stepped up onto the pile of stones and brick and stood centered before the hole. He twisted around just enough to extend his fleshly right hand toward the 2 girls who were still standing rigid, their eyes unblinking and trained ahead. "By her. Don't worry, though," he continued with a smirk. "We know her in a second-hand kind of way." "How is that?" the voice asked. Claire was trying to figure out whether the groggy-sounding voice was a man or a woman. "Her name has been brought up in the rings before," Teik said. "She is Imala." Whispers uttered from every direction, bouncing off the walls. First, only a few voices, but they were soon joined by others. No longer whispers, but hisses all running together so that the words couldn't be understood. Claire and Imala glanced about, trying to find their sources. Claire tried to peer into the shadows above, now very concerned if that was indeed a balcony or something similar up there. She saw nothing, though. No movements, no sudden source of light. "You remember that name, don't you?" Teik asked, still smirking their way. "The one who mentioned her was Samson."